And I suppose if there were ever a time when you'd have earpy digestion, it might be on the morning of your own death by shooting. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. Today we have an answer to a question from PL Atron Eric concerning death by shooting in China, and specifically how that tallies with China's perpetual problem having enough practice ammo for its soldiers. Eric asks the following. You mentioned that executions were typically performed with long guns, but sometimes with pistols as well. Given the extreme ammo scarcity issues in China, I was curious as to why they executed people with firearms at all. Why not use some sort of melee weapon or hanging? Was that considered too barbaric, or was the ammo shortage problem not so bad that they couldn't spare around for a capitalist roader here or there? Good question. Let's take this step by step. First, why did China even adopt shooting as a means of execution in the first place? Traditionally, the Qing dynasty had several ways to deliver capital punishment depending on the status of the offender and the offense. At least one of these was quite gruesome, the Chinese name for it was 凌迟, slow slicing, uh, which was what it sounded like. Typically, though, as I understand it, the Qing dynasty's kind of plain vanilla execution method was to behead people. However, in the early years of the Republic, in the 19 teens, the government in Beijing decided that they were going to try to move to something less associated with the imperial past, something that looked sort of cleaner, less cruel, more modern, which is to say, by the standards of the time, more European. And so in Beijing, they imported a gallows from Italy, and they intended to begin using European style hangings. Now, at this time, China did have some experience administering executions by strangulation. As I understand things, this was used in cases where the status of the offender was such that it would be considered too unseemly to have their head just chopped clean off their body. And so, even though death by strangulation doesn't sound as comfortable as beheading, if comfortable is the word, it was at least more dignified. And as I understand things, I could be wrong about this, strangulation was a sort of concession to the dignity of the person being executed. However, the Republic of China only stuck with hanging for a very short time. In 1926, after just a decade, they adopted new official regulations on execution by shooting. There, those regulations called for the condemned person to stand upright, facing away from the executioner, who would aim for the heart of the condemned by shooting through usually his back, slightly to the left of the spine, from no more than 5 inches away. This was intended to produce death quickly and accurately and fairly cleanly, at least compared to beheading, and other options that had been tried in the meantime. More about that in a moment. And actually, I was wrong. It turns out in the 1926 Republican regulations, they actually called for what they called 短枪, short-barreled weapons. The ideal or paradigm case of that being, of course, a pistol. Now, then things got complicated. Chinese governments in the beginning of Republican history really had a hard time making a policy and then sticking to it. So a decade later, in 1935, the new capital of Nanjing tried to change the country again, back to hanging. And again, I think their idea was that hanging seemed more humane, or at least cleaner and more European. However, they found that hanging had really failed to catch on outside the capital, and that out in the provinces and other localities, people really did not want to even try it. Now, if that seems puzzling to you, trust me, they had good reason to be intimidated by hanging. They had had what you could call some negative experiences. It turns out that there was a serious learning curve for a civilization that did not have experience hanging people to death by the neck in the European fashion. They had this modern gallows imported from Italy, but apparently they didn't read the instructions because they gave the condemned man way too much rope. Now, he was very fat. And to use a phrase that is so splendidly tactful that it only could have come out of dear Tang Dynasty China, the result was that his Head and body became disparately located. 身首异处. Friends, even the English could not have come up with something so beautifully understated. However, I am a crass American. And so, in my American vernacular, I'll simply put it this way. His head was torn clean off of his corpulent body, which then hit the earth like a busted sack of rice. And arterial blood jetted forth out of his neck stump, going like, like in a Quentin Tarantino movie. And this is amazing because speaking of movies, the condemned man was none other than the grandfather of actor Sammo Hung, who was in Enter the Dragon and every blessed Hong Kong Kung Fu movie ever. If you've ever watched a Hong Kong Kung Fu movie from the 70s into the 90s, and there was one big guy who was rather better marbled and had a higher body fat than your average Hong Kong Chinese kung fu actor, uh, pardon me, then dollars to dumplings, that man almost certainly was Sammo Hung. Apparently, a certain girth ran in the family. Well, before the funeral of Sammo Hung's grandfather, the poor family had the head sewn back onto the neck, but all the king's soldiers and all the king's men could not get most Chinese jurisdictions to try this dicey hanging thing after that, especially not if they were going to need like an expensive piece of equipment from Italy only to have heads and bodies separated. Because remember, the whole point of this enterprise was to replace the traditional imperial practice of beheading and keep the spectacle clean and dignified and as non-traumatizing as possible. So even after Nanjing tried to get the whole of China to go back to hanging and really give it an honest shot, instead of shooting, the rest of China simply did not buy in. By this point, Chinese people had been doing a lot of warfare for a lot of decades, and they were confident that they knew how to shoot people. So Nanjing finally relented and said, okay, we'll stick with shooting as our go-to method of judicial execution, and we'll leave hanging on the books as an acceptable alternative in the event that, as Eric anticipated, ammo simply wasn't available for shooting. Now, I gotta say, if you know a little bit about warlord China, you know that there was always enough ammo around to shoot somebody. But certainly it could be that like a certain execution would come due in a certain place and just nobody could find the right cartridges for the right gun. And so for that purpose, hanging was left as an authorized plan B. So it seems that by the communist era, China had simply settled on shooting as its new cultural go-to accustomed execution method. During the PRC days, these things came to be conducted typically in batches. I think that's also true of the ROC. I think it would be traditionally twice a year, ever since imperial days, that there would be a kind of execution season when the death rows in each jurisdiction would be cleared out of the condemned who had been exhausted of their appeals and were finally now due for the execution of their sentence. And I think typically in mainland practice, this involved the condemned only being informed the morning of, and then being fed. Sometimes, traditionally, there's a nice bowl of ginger noodles. I don't know why ginger noodles exactly. In Chinese medicine, ginger is supposed to be quite good for the digestion. Um, and I suppose if there were ever a time when you'd have irpy digestion, it might be on the morning of your own death by shooting. Um, in recent decades, PRC authorities have sometimes also provided a light sedative to the condemned back during the hotter political days of early communist rule, when a lot of people being shot were political prisoners. They would be gagged, often in a particularly undignified and a kind of painful looking way. And that was to prevent them from shouting out counter-revolutionary slogans. as if these people were actual counter-revolutionaries and not just hapless, arbitrary victims of a witch trial. And then traditionally, what happens is that the condemned are all trussed up, not just the usual hands behind the back way that we would find in the Western world, but a sort of distinctive East Asian thing that binds the person very securely, hands and forearms and elbows with a loop around the neck to kind of anchor the whole thing. And then they would be mounted on a truck or trucks. I've seen some of these affairs where the lead vehicle in this convoy then that parades the convicted people through the street to show them to the assembled masses and make a kind of like public execution ritual of it that affirms that law and order is being upheld and that crime doesn't pay. I've seen instances then where the lead vehicle in the convoy that then takes the condemned and the executioners to the execution ground actually has somebody with like a light machine gun perched on the cab of the truck just in case there's some attempt to bust out the condemned criminals. And during this parade, they'll typically have signs around their necks with their names and their crimes, and typically the names are X'd out to show that the person has become a social anathema. And I've even read that sometimes this is done in very dramatic fashion. As the final sentence is read out, the person's sign will simply show their name and their crime. And then after the sentence is formally pronounced, then guards will flip the sign over, and on the reverse sign, they have the name and crime repeated, but this time with a nice X through it to show that the sentence has been passed and upheld. I should mention, by the way, that ever since imperial times, even though China has executed a lot of people per capita, they have a pretty execution forward form of criminal justice. Ever since imperial times, right up to the present, there's been a very elaborate, deliberate process in Chinese judicial systems to pass heavy sentences and then roll them back to 缓刑, as it's called, to at least delay execution. And so a very standard punishment is to have the person sentenced to death, but then have that sentence held in abeyance and often commuted to something lower. So again, to follow the usual procedure to its completion, in kind of like 70s, 80s vintage executions, then this caravan of death vehicles would arrive at the scene of the execution, which would typically be a field outside of town, though sometimes it might be a soccer stadium or something like that to provide for better viewing. And then the condemned person would be made to kneel. This was something that was changed from the ROC regulations. I think it's probably just easier to get a condemned person to kneel, and also maybe a little bit easier for the spectators to watch safely. And then the executioner might have a rifle, but in communist practice, sometimes a pistol. Often I've seen them wearing masks, like sort of, just like COVID type medical masks, which I believe is for practical reasons to keep brain matter specifically out of their mouths. When the sentence is about to be pronounced and the order to fire is about to be given, the executioner may already be standing behind the person with the gun leveled at either the back behind the heart or at the brainstem, depending on circumstances. And allegedly, internal organs are sometimes involved. That is to say, saving them for future donation, shall we say. Sometimes the executioner is already standing there with the gun leveled and ready. At other times, when the order to fire is given, the executioners will march right up, one, two, three, level the gun, shoot. And then always, as soon as the shot is fired, the shooters turn smartly away and walk back. And then finally, the judicial doctor will go and examine each body to make sure that it's really dead and establish whether or not the famous 补枪 or supplementary gunshot is needed. My understanding is that that is very rarely called for. Um, Apparently, military power weapons that are at point blank range are good enough at their jobs. Sometimes I've even heard of cases where where the results were so spectacular, with heads actually being cleaved right in two or exploding like a watermelon, that it's been suspected that maybe the ammo had sort of been scored beforehand to make a sort of homemade frangible bullet that would produce especially spectacular effects. This seems to have been the case more with political prisoners than not. I don't have any certain knowledge of this, but I'm just passing along things that I've heard, and I'm not in a position to confirm myself. Thank heaven. Then to finally get to the answer of why China would continue performing these executions by gunshot, even under conditions of ammo scarcity, I think that it really comes down to a question of scale. The PLA rarely has enough ammo to allow plentiful practice for its servicemen. At most times since the 1950s, the PLA averaged about 4 million service members. So to provide them maybe 5 rounds of practice ammo is 20 million rounds. By Chinese standards, that's a significant expenditure. And if you were ever to double the allotment of practice ammo to say 10 rounds, then you'd be going up to 40 million rounds. That's pretty prohibitive. But in a year where the PRC is actually carrying out something on the order of 10,000 death sentences annually, that's just on the order of, then you could probably cough up that much. So I think that's it. If the 4 million PLA service members were all being executed instead of using practice ammo, maybe the government would need to find a different way. But if it's just a matter of dispatching approximately 10,000 criminals per annum, they can afford that. Now, famously, people in China will tell you that sometimes the families of the condemned prisoners were charged 5毛, the equivalent of 50 Chinese cents for the bullet. I'm told that in some cases that did actually happen. I suspect that that wasn't really so much to keep the budget balanced as it was just kind of like an extra awful fuck you to whatever family had produced the monster that they had just put away. Now, I should close by saying that for about the last 20 years, um, China has been moving principally in the direction of lethal injection rather than shooting. There are some jurisdictions that still use shooting as a possible method, but it's far from the majority now. Most of like the big jurisdictions, um, like the Beijing and Shanghai municipal authorities and most of the provinces have gone over to lethal injection exclusively. If I understand correctly, the the ROC government in Taiwan still uses shooting, though in a sort of kinder, gentler way, where the person is anesthetized and laying down on a mattress. Um, However, I don't know very much about Taiwan, and I don't pretend to. Well, to finally produce an overdue, concise answer to Eric's question, I think that the basic answer is just that 10,000 people or so a year is a number that they can cover with their ammo supplies. but 4 million average service members per year, it provides an ammo shortage when it comes to practice ammo. All right. Thank you for that really excellent question. I've enjoyed talking to you about this. I hope that you still have an appetite. Uh, until next time, this has been Type 56, the story of China's army. If you'd like to support this kind of content, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page. There, you will be able to answer questions for future Q&As like Eric did today. But in any case, this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants.